I know. All right, welcome everybody to the April from the Haystack Rock Nature Talks. We're glad everybody came in from the sunshine to join us this evening. The sad news is that this is the last Nature Talk in our series for the winter of 2023-2024. So the sad news is we won't be meeting once a month through the summer months, but tonight kicks off Earth Day celebration. So the 12 days of Earth Day for Cannon Beach begins with this event, and Friends of Haystack Rock is really thrilled to be part of it. So probably many of you have been involved in 12 days of Earth Day, but if you haven't checked out the calendar, it's really a wonderful list of activities and events. Just a couple I want to highlight for you is on Saturday, we're going to have a pup and watch. We'll be partnering with the Haystack Rock Awareness Group. They're going to be on the beach and we'll have scopes. And if we're lucky, we'll get to see some puppies. So that's Saturday from 8 to noon. And then Sunday at 1 o'clock, we'll be back in this room from 1 to 3 this Sunday. And we're going to be showing a film in partnership with Parks Committee. We're showing Hasina Bank, and we've arranged to show the film and also have a panel of 3 folks from Oregon State University who are experts in this pristine marine garden that's along the Oregon coast. So we hope you'll be able to join us on Sunday. Let me go ahead and introduce our speaker this evening. Our speaker is Chris Wold, and Chris is going to be talking about protecting public access to Oregon. And Chris is somewhat of an expert, I would say, not somewhat, I would say he is an expert. He teaches law at Lewis and Clark Law School, and he teaches ocean and coastal law and other environmental and international. So he's somewhat of an expert about how we came to have these fabulous public images. A little more about Chris. He's represented governments at meetings of the International Whaling Commission and served as the legal advisor to Convention on Migratory Species, most recently being in Uzbekistan, right? So Chris was part of the International Migratory Bird Advisory Committee. He was also part of the National Advisory Committee to provide the EPA with advice on environmental cooperation in the Green North American Gulf. So we are really thrilled to have Chris and his expertise here this evening. The other thing that's amazing about Chris is he is also on the board of Rock. And so he is very involved in what we do, and he's an avid bird. So he's already been spotting in the cool birds middle of the day. So mixed results, but we're thrilled to have. So please join me to welcome.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Angela. And I also want to give a special thank you to Tiffany, who's been organizing the Nature Talks series for years. She does a fantastic job. So our beaches around the world, but in the United States and even here in Clatsop County, are currently under threat due to sea level rise, increased storm surges. And so I thought it would be useful to kind of take a step back to see how we in Oregon got to this point where the public has access to the sandy beaches at a minimum from the Columbia River down to the border of California. To provide a bit of context, though, because I teach international law as well, I always think it's useful to go big picture and then down to the grains of sand, literally on our beach here. So in international law, it has long recognized that the countries of the world have sovereignty over some area beyond the shores, right? And up through into the mid 1990s, that distance was 3 miles, right? And the idea was that in earlier times, not certainly by the 1990s, but that's the distance you could shoot a cannonball. And thus, for national security reasons, a coastal state like the United States should be able to call that area its sovereign territory, just like the terrestrial area of that country. Right. That changed in the 1990s with a new treaty called the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which now extends that to 12 miles. But the key point here is that, at least with respect to relations between government countries, it was understood that it was the country that had sovereignty over this territory. Now it would be up to the individual countries to determine what they do within that territory, right? And for the United States, we had a number of Supreme Court cases that made very clear that it was the states that owned the submerged lands up to the mean high tide line. Now, including in a very famous case of Shively v. Wold, which took place just on the shores of the Columbia River, where the Supreme Court made very clear that it was the state of Oregon and not the private landowners that controlled what we call the submerged lands beneath the Columbia River. Now, importantly, what these cases didn't have as a key fact was property facing the ocean. All of these cases dealt with waters that were subject to the ebb and flow of the tide, but they were all just inland, as in the Columbia River. There's another famous case from Mobile, Alabama, and some others on the East Coast. Based on these cases, though, all the states assumed that they also owned the submerged lands facing the ocean. And the federal government did as well. The federal government never challenged any states seeking to regulate fishing activities or other activities off the coast of the state. Until in the post-World War II era, we started exploiting oil and gas resources. Just into this territorial, what's known as the territorial sea, this 3 miles extending from the coastline. And so California said, well, it's ours. We have all these Supreme Court cases that tell us the submerged lands are ours. And finally, the federal government, through the Department of Interior, said, wait a second, we think there are valuable oil and gas resources, and we want those resources for the federal government. So it goes up to the Supreme Court, and the state of California, quite sensibly, is arguing we've got all this jurisprudence saying states own the submerged lands subject to the ebb and flow of the tide. Now, the question was, as we face the ocean, how far out should that go? And California said, well, out to 3 miles, right? That's what international law says. But the Supreme Court was persuaded by the government's use of national security arguments to say that the federal government has paramount rights. Now, interestingly, the court never says who actually owns the submerged lands extending from the coast of our states. It just says the federal government has paramount rights. So it was clear that, at least just in the immediate period after the case, that it was going to be the federal government that got to authorize any oil and gas development off the coast. But our Congress said, well, wait a second, there are a lot of coastal states here. Why don't we create some legislation to clarify just who owns the submerged lands, right? And so in 1953, Congress comes back with the Submerged Lands Act, which makes very clear that it's the states that not only own the submerged lands out to 3 miles, but they also own or have the right to regulate any of the living and non-living resources within that territory. Now, we're still going to allow the Congress and the federal government to regulate for national security interests, but that doesn't include permitting for oil and gas development. Now, we get to the beach itself. We know from all these Supreme Court cases that, and the Submerged Lands Act, that it's the states that own up to the mean high tide. But then, and within this area, between the mean low tide line and the mean high tide line, the states are also supposed to ensure public access. And this is pursuant to another legal doctrine we call the public trust doctrine. And the states must protect that land, what we call the wet sands area, for the public to engage in commerce, fishing, and navigation, right? So those are kind of the original 3 purposes and things that states needed to protect for the public. Then in most states, it was the private property owner that owned to the mean high tide line. Right? So all those beautiful sands that we see on Cannon Beach, right? Most of those are probably still privately owned, right? I haven't looked at property deeds in Clatsop County, but most property owners on the beach own to the mean high tide line. But of course, then the question is, well, if I, as a member of the public, can use the wet sands area, what happens at high tide? Right? And what happens if I get tired fishing? Can I go rest in the dry sands area? Or just what rights do I have? And there became a period of time where we saw a proliferation of signs, right? Private landowners wanting to prevent the public from crossing their private property to get to the beach. And then there's the separate question of whether our landowners that have ocean fronting property can prevent the public from crossing the beach, right? Because it's their private property. As I'm sure most of us, if we're not ocean fronting property owners, don't want the public just walking across our property, right? And so the question is, could they do that, right? And so over time, we've seen a number of different legal theories used by the public or by the state trying to ensure access. One is rooted in that doctrine of the public trust. In New Jersey, the court said, what value is it for the public to use that slim slice of wet sands area if during high tide they can't relax and rest on the dry sands area? So the way they implement this notion in New Jersey, the courts and now the cities will be asked to determine if there is adequate public access on public lands to access the beach and then to use the beach. But if there isn't, now we can start using private lands to access the beach. And we as the public can use their dry sands areas, something that is part of their private property, to continue to enjoy our public trust rights to, and now they've expanded beyond navigation, fishing, and commerce to include swimming, kayaking, canoeing. Each state implements the public trust doctrine a little bit differently and has a different range of activities that are part of the public trust, but certainly many recreational activities are now part of that. This doctrine, if you've been paying attention to things happening in Lake Oswego, is of importance for public access. And I'll just stop here briefly because this isn't about the beach, but one of my colleagues at Lewis and Clark convinced some of his students to bring a case against Lake Oswego saying, you've privatized the beach. the whole lake, right? You don't allow any public access. And after years of litigation, the Oregon Supreme Court agreed that this was a lake subject to the public trust doctrine. The state had title to it and must provide access. They are now selecting jurors for the second round of the litigation, which is to determine whether Lake Oswego's restrictions on access, which is total restriction on access to the public, unless you're part of the Lake Oswego Corporation, you're one of the landowners right there, it is reasonable, right, and consistent with the public trust doctrine. So keep your eyes open for that case. But we see that this isn't just a New Jersey concept to ensure access. It is one that advocates for public access are using around the country. Now, there are other theories, and these two, prescription and dedication, are rooted very deeply in private property law, although they are typically designed to really protect the private property owner. Now, first of all, I just want us to reflect on this slide, this 10-mile-an-hour speed limit on the beach, and this, right? So this is obviously not Oregon. This is Florida. Part of the reason why we have the beaches we have is the way we protect our beaches here, not just the legal theory that allows us public access, but how our Oregon state parks has managed the beach. There are only, I think it's 5 or 6 places in Oregon where you're allowed to drive on the beach. So one of the keys to these ideas of prescription and dedication is that a lot of requirements must be met, right? And I'm not going to go through these, right? But the key is that has the public been using that area for the statutory period identified in the relevant law? Right, so in Oregon, we would have to show, if prescription is going to be our legal theory to get public access, that the public has been using the beach for 10 years without permission. It's known to the landowner, right? And meet all the other requirements. An important part of the concept of prescription is that it applies only to a single property. So keep that in mind when we will soon get to the Oregon case. And then with dedication, a private property owner can dedicate to the public the right to use a particular area. This often happens in subdivisions, right? We have one developer build all the houses and build all the roads. And as part of you then buying a house from that developer, you will have, as part of your deed, the right to use the roads in that subdivision, because the developer will dedicate that road to all members of the subdivision. This, of course, also can happen in coastal areas, and in California, in many other places, courts have concluded that the private property owner has typically given implied dedication. You don't often see private property owners that have valuable oceanfront property specifically tell the public that they can use their dry sands area. It is often implied by failing to keep the public off your dry sands area. But again, it only applies to a specific property, right? So if we're thinking of Cannon Beach, we would have to go from one homeowner. Has there been some kind of express or implied dedication, or have we met prescription? And then if the next door neighbor wanted to litigate, that next door neighbor could also litigate saying, no, I haven't given I've expressed no intent to allow the public to use that beach. So for places in Texas, in Florida, where prescription and dedication have been used, we have, as a public, some real problems, right? Because prescription and dedication only gives you a right to use the area that you've been using for that 20 years, or where the homeowner told you could walk. When we start losing beach, as we are, you're now moving the beach closer to the homes, where you haven't been used, you as the public, we as the public haven't been walking on those dry sands areas for the 20 years or the 10 years, whatever the statute says must be the length of time. Or certainly, and as in this case, I'm sure the property owner isn't saying, come and hang out on my steps. Right? Right? There's no intent to dedicate that area to the public. So in places where prescription and dedication are the primary means for the tenant to get access, public access is under real threat. Now let's move to Oregon. Oregon has had a long tradition of at least attempting to ensure public access to all of the beach, right? And we go all the way back to 1913. Governor Oswald West says the length of the coast is essentially a public highway, right? Not for vehicles necessarily, but that was the terminology used to indicate that this was public lands for the people. Now, what he didn't do, right? He stuck very closely to existing law at the time. You can see he only made, or is declaring to be this public highway, the land between the mean low tide and the mean high tide, right? So he's not saying anything about the dry sands area, the land that is private property owned by our oceanfront property owners. But nonetheless, right, he's starting to get support for this idea that the public has some kind of right here. Now, things stayed calm for about 50 years. There were no, I haven't been able to locate any disputes concerning public access to beaches from 1913 to 1966. And that's when the owners, the prior owners of the Surfsand Hotel started putting up fences to keep the public off their dry sands area. Cannon Beach is starting to become popular, and as the property owner of a hotel, the owners wanted to keep the dry sands area private for clients of the hotel. So these aren't the actual fences. I'm trying to get the picture of the actual fences. But not only did the owners put logs that ran parallel to the beach, the Supreme Court case indicates that the owners also put fences that were perpendicular to the coast, right? So really keep making that whole area solely, or attempting to make it solely for the clients of the hotel. Now, this worried our, at that time, new governor, Governor Tom McCall, right? He thought that the beaches should be made publicly accessible, and not just the wet sand area, but these dry sands areas that are part of private property. And so he started working with legislators to draft a law that would allow the public that kind of access. It became clear, however, that that there was opposition to any what became the beach bill, but there was opposition from many sectors who thought, well, no, I mean you're taking away private property rights. And so Governor McCall said, well, we need to do some publicity, right? So he came to Cannon Beach, and this famous picture was taken. But in addition, right, it was a bit serendipitous. There were some geologists working a little farther to the south, and they had a helicopter. And he said, why don't you fly to Cannon Beach? And it was really just to drum up the media, right? You've got the governor, you've got a helicopter. He didn't actually take the helicopter. He was in a limousine. But it had the intended effect, right? The media reported on this. But in addition, right, you do the theater, right? All this was really important to finally get the Oregon legislature to agree on compromise legislation that became the beach bill. Now, an important, and so just kind of looking at what is in the beach bill, because the beach bill is often said to be the reason we have public access, and that's not really true, right? So we see that in the beach bill, it says, as Governor Oswald West did 50 years prior to this, that we're going to just declare this area to be the state's. In the first paragraph here, it doesn't tell us exactly what the area is, but that's the intent, that we are going to try to find some way to guarantee public access to beaches. That is the dry, what we call the dry sands area. That is private property. And significantly, so as part of the compromise, the Oregon legislature doesn't try to create new rights. It's in the bill recognizing existing rights. And you see rights that are easements or dedication, prescription, grant, or something else, right? But the Oregon legislature isn't saying we are now declaring all dry sands areas to be the public's, right? It's still looking to use existing property law concepts to allow the public to access these dry sands areas. So that's one part that's so it's the part that is often considered the provision that gives us all this access. But you can see, and we will see much more clearly when we look at the Oregon Supreme Court cases, that it's really not the beach bill that gives us that access. But it did another thing. It said, if you are going to build a structure in the dry sands area, like a fence or anything else, you need to get permission from the government, right? And that became important, right? Because now we're giving specific legislative authority to our agencies to allow or not allow certain structures. And at the time, if you were to look and didn't make a slide of what the requirements were, it was pretty clear no one was going to be building a fence or anything else in this dry sands area. And it's at this point that the owners of the Surf Sand Hotel sued the state for taking of private property without compensation, using provisions of the Oregon Constitution, but also the U.S. federal Constitution. And what we learn in this case, notice Thornton v. Hay, with Hay being the owners of the hotel, the court first looks at dedication, because that's what the Oregon Attorney General argued. Right? It's in the beach bill, right? It's the accepted property law concept for getting access, right? And the Oregon Supreme Court says, nah, it's unlikely that the landowners thought they had anything to dedicate because it's dry sands. You can't really build anything on dry sands. But clearly, the Hays did not think that was true, although their first fence was destroyed by a storm. Then the second fence apparently was much stronger and stayed. But sir, my guess is owners thought they owned that land, but that had nothing to do with whether they wanted to build, or the fact that they couldn't build on it didn't negate their view that they actually owned that land and could preclude the public from being on their property. But the Supreme Court, with very little analysis, just says it's unsteady, it's sandy, it moves around. You can't build on sand. So landowners probably didn't think they had private property to dedicate. And then with prescription, prior to this case, there is a case from Tillamook County where some developers wanted to exclude the public, and the Tillamook Circuit Court says there is a recreational easement, right, by prescription, right? So relying on that concept of prescription to say that the public has a right to be on the dry sands area over, forgetting what the exact length of the road and beach was, but it was a couple of different properties, so it was a good chunk, but it was still just a portion of the beaches in the Tillamook area. The court says, well, it only applies to a specific tract. We don't want to do that, right? We'll be tied up in litigation for years as private landowners try to exclude the public from their beach, and we have to go through that multi-part analysis to determine whether or not the public has been using that area for 10 years and determine whether the elements are met. Even though it wasn't argued by the Attorney General, the court on its own says we've got a different idea. It's called custom, right? And it's rooted in English common law. And it applies to whatever territory you want it to apply to, where if the elements of custom are met, right? And so the court says, this is much better because we don't want to hear all these cases, and there will be takings cases. So you have committed landowners, and as a consequence, you will have motivated landowners who pursue litigation, perhaps as the Hayes did, up to the Supreme Court. And the court concludes, based on the record, we can see that the public has been using this area and similarly situated lands area for over an ancient period, or from ancient days, right? And it uses, and then it looks into the facts. It's certainly in the Cannon Beach area, the last, since white settlement, people had been using the beach, but the court even goes farther back than that, finding evidence that Native Americans have been using this area for recreation and other purposes as well. Now, I'm not going to go into these elements because the court barely did, right? The court listed all these elements and then just said they exist here, right? And a lot of it made sense, right? There was a somewhat longer analysis of whether the use had been wrong in general, right? As I said, looking at Native American use, but also saying it's just reasonable, right? People aren't using it in unreasonable ways. They're just walking up and down the beach. I don't know if we were flying kites yet at the time, but in any event, there were no parties, things like that. But if there were, then there was intervention by the police, right? So the court is satisfied that the uses of the beach here are consistent with a reasonable use, but also community customs. So everyone cheers the case. It appears we have access as the public to all of the beaches along the Oregon coast. And then a little to the south, around Depot Bay, the owner of this house says, no, I don't want other people using my beach. And the plaintiff in that case, McDonald, says, well, wait a second, you've got the Thornton v. Hay case. I have access. And here's the property, right? So there's the house, and I haven't gotten the deed, but somehow Halverson owns the sandy area as well, or at a minimum controls this bluff, controls the one safe way to get down to it. And the court says, no, Thornton v. Hay doesn't say you have, as the public, access to all coastal land. The land has to abut the ocean, and then it has to be, that area needs to be used consistently with those elements of custom. And the court here says, that doesn't abut the ocean. Now, at high tide, it does, right? So this is a low tide picture, but at high tide, that's all water. But the court says, given that rocky area that keeps water out for much of the day, that's enough to say the land does not abut the ocean. Right, and then the court doesn't make any specific conclusion about whether that area had been used consistently with custom, but definitely indicated that probably not, given way that this rocky area prevents people from using the beach as we use the beach here at Cannon Beach. So the conclusion of these two cases then is that the concept of custom applies to beaches that are similarly situated to those here in Cannon Beach. Now, they don't have to be sandy. They can still be rocky or a little bit rocky, but certainly they have to face the ocean or butt the ocean, I should say, and show that there has been long and general use of that by the public. And that's how things have stood for some time. Well, I mean, it's still the law in Oregon, but we're now being challenged in ways that are new. With as I started the presentation with, we are seeing erosion due to rising sea levels and stronger storm surges, and this is right just. Observed sea level rise since 1890 is 8 to 9 inches, right? So whatever erosion we've been seeing is just 8 to 9 inches of sea level rise. But that's where we're going, right? So worst case analysis, rise of 7 feet. But even the best case scenario, it's more than a foot. So, and these are projections from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, right? Our world's leading experts that don't do original research themselves, but synthesize the research that has been done by others, right? So the totality of all that research tells us that that's what we can expect on the best end and the worst end. And at 8 and 9, this 8 to 9 inches of sea level rise, already we're seeing huge amounts of flooding, coastal flooding, and a recent paper shows us that Tillamook County, just to the south, 40% of the coastline is eroding at rates of 3 feet per year. So that's just with a sea level rise of 8 to 9 inches. So the trajectory is not positive, right? And we can come up with all kinds of pictures from the coast of Oregon, and these are just a few. What that is doing, right, is bringing our private landowners to the Oregon Parks and Recreation Department, saying we want hard structures. We want riprap or some other way to protect our houses from this kind of erosion. So how do we go about protecting the beach, right? In some states, Massachusetts, Florida, and elsewhere, we're seeing lots of re-nourishment activities, right? The beach gets eroded, they dredge up a bunch of sand, dump it back on the sand, on the beach, right? And that can be successful, but it's really only going to be a short-term success, right? So here, right, as you see, the beach, the new beach, the nurse beach just gone after a single storm. Those property owners are still planning to do it again. Because they said it was worth it, because it protected our houses. Without the renourished beach, our houses would have been gone, right? Maybe they should rethink where their houses are, but in any event, we're in Florida, they're spending billions, and they're not even close to renourishing all the beaches. Already close to half of the beaches in Florida are considered critically eroded. Now, for Florida, they have deemed it worthwhile to go to spend these billions of dollars to renourish their beaches because of the impact of tourism, the impact of the beaches on tourism. In Oregon, we've taken a different approach, right? We've said no development of riprap or other hard structures, provided that there was but allow it, I should say, where development existed before 1977. right? And development means you've got your house there already, or you've built some roads, you've got utilities that are set to provide services to your property. Now, why 1977? The Oregon legislature specifically said we want this law only, this new prohibition on protected structures to affect properties that want to be developed after the date of that act, because they try to apply to existing developments. The state would risk, again, Fifth Amendment takings claims. We had a right when we bought the property to put hard structures, and now you're taking that away from us. The Oregon legislature says that we don't want to face that, so it will only be for new development. Right, and the Supreme Court in another case from South Carolina said that where there are background principles that deny private property owners the full bundle of property rights, there won't be a taking of private property. So existing law, things like the public trust doctrine that limit how private property owners can use their property. These are some of the background principles that have been found to withstand takings claims. So as part of getting approval for your riprap, which is the most common, right? We put big rocks in front of the house or the bluff to dissipate the wave energy. There are a number of standards. I'm only throwing up a couple, but we see that there's the riprap should not impose a detriment to public recreation use, right? We're trying to, through the permitting process, avoid blocking public access to the beach. We're as the private property owners building the riprap, minimize obstructions to pedestrians or vehicles along the ocean, etc., and minimize erosion. So certainly, goal 18 has minimized the number of property owners, at least to date, that have been successful in getting their riprap approved. Right. And for good reason. Well, there's a good reason for goal 18. We know that the science tells us that riprap in front of house A will protect the property of house A owner, but it's going to cause problems for those who are down current, because that's where the wave energy is going to go. And this recent study shows us that this is true. Not only are the down current homes damaged by erosion, but consequently the value of their homes, their properties declines, even as the value of the property with the riprap increases, right? Which is exactly what we expect, knowing what the science tells us about erosion caused by riprap and other hard structures. So we have had, in the last 5 years, 91 actual applications for hard structures. 90 have been approved. So I've been trying to figure out why that is, right? Most of them are from Lincoln County and Tillamook County, although, as many of you may know, there's a recent approval for here in Cannon Beach. And I was talking to one of the permitting officials today, and he says, well, you see a lot of approvals because we're working with the landowners to do it right. If they want to do this, let's try to do it in a way that's going to be good for their property, but also as good as possible for neighboring properties. Right? And they all get experts in design of riprap and understanding of ocean currents and what the erosion to neighboring properties will be. But at the moment, right, the Oregon, so it's Oregon Parks and Recreation Department is concluding that the applications are meeting Oregon standards, and as a consequence, they are approving the permits. There have been some cases, however, where the permit hasn't issued, but it's often because the property wasn't developed before 1977. Right. So in those cases, the landowner is seeking an exception to the rules through the county. And so far, to my knowledge, well, I think at least almost all of those have been denied. I'm hoping it's all, but I don't want to be so definitive. So 90 approvals in 5 years along the coast of Oregon. Is that a large number? I don't know, but I'm certain the number is going to increase due to sea level rise, increased storm surges. It just is inevitable, right? This land and these houses are extremely valuable, right? And I think people want to protect those homes. So what are the opportunities then for minimizing the issuance of permits for riprap and other large structures? One is, and I know this happened in the Cannon Beach case, but almost it never happens in other cases, and that is public engagement. Most of the applications show that the public notice was given, a minimum of 30 days was provided to the public to comment, and nobody commented. In a couple of examples that I could find where the public did comment and comment adversely to the private landowner, but with specific comments as to how their properties or somebody's property would be harmed, adjustments were made to the project, to the design of the riprap. Now, it didn't prevent the permit from issuing, but at least steps were taken by the state agency to ensure that the concerns of the public were met. Now, that might be, that kind of gets us to the Oregon Supreme Court's way of thinking, right? We're going permit by permit, property by property, and that's a difficult way to go if we're trying to ensure that that riprap isn't put in place and possibly then eroding beaches and causing less access to the public to dry sands areas. And so maybe the better approach is to dig into relevant Oregon shores law, some of these goals, to make them clear as to what is required when riprap applications are submitted. One of the comments of agency personnel is that the relevant standards are not always very clear, and where there's some ambiguity, and we've got a property developed prior to 1977, and the developer, the homeowner seems willing to take some additional steps, then the agency feels perhaps that it should issue the permit. But with clear standards, more black and white standards, and with those standards clearly saying exactly when riprap and other structures are not permitted, maybe that's going to be our coast-wide solution to ensure that our beaches don't erode at a faster rate due to these hard structures. And with that, thank you for your attention. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer. Yes.
I'll start with there. So can you describe the difference between riprap and what the project is?
It's just a different material. So those burritos are some kind of plastic substance, but the effect is the same. The thinking is that the softer structures are because they're a little more forgiving, don't perhaps have as great of erosive effect on neighboring properties. I don't know if there's science to back that, because the effect is the same. The waves coming in, it's blocked by whether it's a softer material or a harder material.
Another thing, several formulation. For that,
Yes.
I think I know what you're gonna be talking about. Really hard, perfect. Right. Probably that's significant.
Yeah. So I don't know the answer to that, but it's a great question and giving you some homework.
Sorry to say, interesting, well, all of this is 100% true. Seaside actually experiencing a little bit between communities on the north side of the estuary. Because where did you go? The sand is accumulating so much year after year, and the density is so big that we're not like, we were for the first fires from the 20s and surface coming back to the playground, we walking over the playground. It never hits the playground. And so we've got this issue there, and we have to chip the third. And so she's kind of, and I know most of that's because of the jelly. But yeah.
Yeah, so anytime we put up hard structures or just have ocean property, like there are going to be winners and losers. Some will have erosion occur on their property, some will have accretion, recognition, sand. So you're one of those, well, I don't know if it's a happy place. Because you gotta get rid of, maybe you gotta get rid of the sand, or if it's blocking the roads, right, yeah. Yes.
Curious about.
So Washington uses either prescription or dedication, although it's never specifically excluded the possibility of using the public trust or custom. For whatever reason, the Washington attorneys general have not argued those claims. So it's to date been, as I said, prescription or dedication. And that's true for a lot of states. So Texas says custom is theoretically possible, but it's never agreed to explore whether custom applies. Yes.
The strip between high tide and low tide. That moves back and forth. Inside, now, the line with the steps that then you can find it over losing and giving and steps now seem to be on public land.
So this is the unfortunate but correct legal answer. It depends. So in Florida, you are given a reasonable period of time to reclaim your beach. And if you don't, then the state takes ownership of the land now from the new high tide line seaward. In Texas, Texas says, no, the moment that there is huge erosion, something we call avulsion, the new beach area or the new submerged lands between mean high tide and mean low tide is the state's right now. There's no opportunity for private landowners to reclaim the beach.
So the step owner, in fact, the lose the step.
Well, not to the public, to the state eventually, right? Because the public's not going to be able to show it, use that area for the required period of time.
No, they're using, I'm just thinking, they're used between the old and high. Moves with, whether they were on it up there.
So the public can stay in that strip. They just can't go above the mean high tide line, right? Which is of course what most of the public wants. We'll be in the water, here for a very short period of time. Right, so eventually, and we're seeing this, eventually the house is in that area. Well, no, what we're gonna conclude is that the house is now a public nuisance and has to be removed.
You just asked me like that. Thank you.
Yeah, and I could show you all kinds of great videos of houses actually floating out to sea.
Water. Great. Many of which lives in different the argument was made and property owners basically what recently what have been paid property tax on that year they have their contents. I don't remember how far it's not gotten into the yeah. How that's.
It hasn't, in Oregon, it hasn't affected it at all. But that was one of the arguments that Hayes were making. That we're paying taxes on this. The deed says our property line ends at the mean high tide line. And the court just said, we're dealing with unique land, right? That is encumbered with this custom and as a consequence, the public has access to it.
So, and I have to offset on it really, hotel owners and seaside, they have the ability to take people. And they have, and they said that other state parks and all the time, I think it's 3 times a year where they do it. So just recently, there was a couple of them that got together that wanted to do the duties. But the price has gone up so much that it was gonna cost them $80,000 to do the public lot. And it's not worth it. And for them, it's just a big there, it shouldn't be. And I only know that because they asked us to do. Well, you can do ours, but not.
So it said the dunes are becoming too high, so the
Yeah, so
people in the hotel don't have a view of the ocean.
when I started at there and I'm sitting in a ticket booth, you could see the ocean. I can't see the ocean from the street. We have to go to our upstairs apartments to see the. I was kind of under a misimpression about what you were talking about.
Yeah.
I thought you would be, talking about the trail to the beach somewhere down south where a woman fell and was suing or something, and so they decided to close that access. This is a state property.
So I'm not familiar with all the facts of the case, but there, as I understand it, there's an easement that allowed the public to go from, say, the street to the beach. But the easement was owned by a private property owner. And in that case, you're right, the person who fell successfully sued the owner for not maintaining the easement. But just yesterday, I think just yesterday, Governor Kotek signed a law to make it clear that as long as the easement, as long as there hasn't been gross negligence, and there's been an attempt to improve the public access, that if you fall and break your leg or whatever, you don't have a claim against the property. Just yesterday.
Right now.
Oh. Anything else?
I just remember you said the date was 1913 when Governor
West.
You know, wasn't that because it actually was drivable access? I mean, they drive on the beach to then, oh, I know. Deliver mail. stuff like that.
So some of that surely was happening at the time, but his intent was to ensure public access to the beach. And just the language used at the time was to declare these certain things public.
Which is why the whales got blown up in Florence, because I don't remember the boat. They all flew in Florence and said, "Okay, go away and say highway."
Oh, very
I just like
interesting.
throw that out, so you don't have to name it.
That's stated. Yes.
Sometimes really from, I'm not a closer. 1923. Remember, the brother is talking about all the old guns. And if I remember. It's basically smugglers of the brother Richard.
Well, my notes say 1913. Yes.
Chris, I know there's a particular picture of the for this might be a good to ask.
Oh, well, yeah. So no one seems to have a picture from 1966, 1967 of the fences that ran perpendicular to the Surf Sands property. The picture with Tom McCall shows the logs running parallel. I have, yes, and I've walked over to the Surf Sand. If you've been in any restaurants or other hotels where maybe there's a picture that looks like that, let me know. Yes, yeah.
Chris, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Don't forget, birthday, that's full stop on. What's going on tomorrow?
Tomorrow is, no, celebration.